Well, Terry had told me earlier that we were scheduled for storms here, and I was going, it's news to me. 5 o'clock, sweetheart. Oh, we are recording. Well, good. Lindsay's here. Sarah's here. Well, that's good. All right. Let's see. Looks good. Okay. Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty well. What's going on in your world right now?
The coronavirus.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is, um, have they shut everything down where you live, or how
Pre-
how are things working there?
Well, they're pretty much our schools are out at least until April the 17th. Not all non-essential businesses are closed, and our churches are closed. Um, so and we've got one church here. It's not a Nazarene church. It's an Assembly of God church that all 47 members of their church have tested positive.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Now where is my screen? There it is right there. There we go. I'm just making sure I'm getting everything lined up for tonight's session here. So I'm working through what I'm doing here. All right. This is not making things easy here. There we go. Let me get rid of that. I'm trying to manage my screens at the moment, as you might imagine. Um, it doesn't take much imagination to see that that's what I'm trying to do.
Anything I can help with, Bill?
Hey, James.
Hey,
I don't think it's a big issue at this point. I've just got to get everything lined up here. Give me just a second.
I just popped in to start the recording like we talked about. So,
Yeah, thanks for popping in. I appreciate that. I'm trying to move
Or the Lego
things
movie.
around on my screen. Lindsay, you.
Hi. Sorry, I didn't realize you were hearing all that. The Lego movie.
Whoop, I'm having storms. There are storms moving through my area, so I have no idea from one moment to the next how. So let's see.
Yeah,
Hey,
your audio is a little glitchy for me right now.
seeing me?
Yeah. I can see you fine, yeah. But the
Okay.
audio is kind of gobbly.
Audio is
Maybe.
sketchy. Let's see here. Is that any better? Not any better?
I think we'll just have to see as you talk more.
Okay, well, we'll have to see as I talk more. Try this right here. Does that make a difference right there? Is it any better? Any worse?
It's good right now.
Ideally, I would just use my headphones. There we go.
Yeah, I gotta get
Yeah,
this.
there you are. Hey, James, desktop sharing isn't supported in your browser, is what I'm seeing. Does that really matter right now?
are you planning on sharing anything from your desktop?
No,
Talking.
I'm just talking. So
Then,
I don't think I need it.
yeah,
I think we're good there.
yeah. If that's ever going to be a problem, you might want to see about getting Chrome loaded for you. But you can do that another night if you're on here and lecturing tonight. That'll be good. You'll be set.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Hi, Amy.
Hi.
How are you?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Okie doke.
Are you feeling better?
Yeah, I'm feeling pretty good.
Good.
I'm feeling pretty good. Yeah. Oh, I just heard myself. I'm getting a lot of wonderful feedback. Now it's gone. Well, it doesn't do anybody any good to have a iPad fall on the floor from the top of the desk. How about that? Well, let's see. It's we got about 6 minutes to wait on everybody to get in place. I've heard from Justina, and she's gonna join us. I need to send her a text. It just dawned on me that James is recording this because she had asked. I don't know. There are probably a lot of people who feel that way tonight.
Hey, this is Justina. I wanted to let you know I'm here, but it's
right.
And video is like, I keep trying to turn camera on, and it says, hang on. Well, okay, so I clicked on privacy policy, but it's still not.
If you go to your settings and type in the search box when general settings comes up, put in camera, and then you enable apps to use your camera, it should come up. So we got about 5 minutes, so go ahead and see if you can do that. Well, I feel like it's been forever since we've been together. It feels that way. It really does. I'm having to get used to the fact that the book is not arranged in the same order that I'm used to. Have you noticed any of that? You notice that you've got Nehemiah and Ezra and Daniel and Esther before Chronicles. Isn't that something? But that's the Jewish Old Testament. Chronicles is the last thing in their Old Testament. So sometimes you have to go to the index to find where you want to go until you get really used to it. If you get used to using this for the Old Testament, it'll fall into place eventually. But, it takes a while. There it is.
How are you feeling from your sickness? Are you back to 100%?
I feel pretty good. I worked last week at the day job, but I think Sarah was telling me that in Little Rock, most everything's been shut down, like in Nashville. Well, let me rephrase that. In Nashville, the exemption list is so long that it's kind of funny. And I'm not sure exactly how many people who might be on the kind of on the line are just choosing to be open and go to work anyway, because there are a lot of exemptions. The shooting range is open. All the auto parts houses are open, all of them. Of course, if you leave one open, you have to leave them all open. every single big box retailer is open. Go figure. Everything that sells something relative to home repair, everything that sells something relative to vehicle repair, it doesn't matter what it is, if they can claim that, yeah, it has to do with home or vehicle upkeep or maintenance or repair, they're open. That's a lot of places. Everything that has to do with food and everything that has to do with finance, including insurance agencies, are all exempt from having to close. So it's a pretty long list.
I wonder if that list is that long everywhere or if that's unique to our Nashville situation with having just had tornadoes.
You know, it's a good question. And that does color the situation here, doesn't it? Because these people are, they're in a position where they've just been hit with what is for most everybody a once in a lifetime thing. And then they get this double whammy where all of those volunteers suddenly disappeared. Kind of interesting.
My dad works at the Home Depot in
Huh?
my dad works at the Home Depot in Hermitage,
Yeah.
and they're still open, so he's still been going to work and still getting people, getting stuff to repair roofs and
Right.
whatever. So
And we've had so much rain here, I don't even know what to do. You're at a point of going, my goodness, how can you repair stuff when it's pouring rain all the time? We're supposed to get a break here. Does anybody know regarding Middle Tennessee? Are we supposed to have big storms tonight?
Yes.
Oh my.
yeah,
I'm
I was
sure-
just looking at the weather a little while ago, and it's looking like around 6 to 8 is when it's going to really kind of hit the Nashville area.
Okay.
So thunderstorms with a little bit of red and yellow in there on the
Red and
radar.
yellow.
Yeah. Yeah.
They moved through here earlier today, and they were really rough here.
Really?
Yes.
Oh me.
And
Well-
they closed. I was going to tell you, they've closed all of our barber shops, all of our beauty shops, all of our tattoo parlors, all of our. You cannot go anywhere in Jonesboro or the surrounding areas and dine in anywhere. You have to go through drive-through.
Right.
So it's getting pretty. It's getting pretty sketchy here.
It is getting sketchy.
I had a funeral Friday, and I have another one coming up this coming Friday, and they're allowing 10 people at a time. You cannot go to the cemetery. The funeral home is taking the body to the cemetery and burying it, but the family cannot go. And the funeral that I did Friday, the immediate family was larger than 10, but you can only have 10 people at a time. Visitation, you can have a walkthrough, but that
Right.
you walk in the funeral home, walk by, you can't talk, you can't mingle, you can't do anything.
That's overkill.
I
That's
agree.
overkill. And especially outside, there is no good reason to deny a small party of the family outside observation. There's just no reason for that.
I agree, and they have told us that. There was a funeral today of a young mother who had cancer that died, and they would not even let her children come in.
Nah, that's wrong. That is
I
not
agree.
wrong.
And they're telling the families, and this is what I don't understand, they're telling the families that after all of this is over, that they can come back to the funeral home and have a memorial service at no charge. But it's like the family I dealt with Friday and the family I'm dealing with this week says, who wants to reopen all of that? Who wants to come back in 6 months and reopen all these wounds?
That's just bad. Wow. Well, for about 3 hours, a little bit more, 4 hours at most, let's escape.
Thank you.
Let's go back, and as we go back, we're able to also look forward. There are a lot of readings tonight, and I'm going to ask all of you to read. I'm going to read the opening, which is Zephaniah, and I'm going to read the first chapter. This is the word of Adonai that came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah. Yeah, who you are matters, okay? The son of Hezekiah, during the reign of Yoshiyahu, the son of Ammon, king of Yehuda. I will completely sweep away everything off the face of the land, says Adonai. I will sweep away humans and animals, the birds in the air and the fish in the sea, also the wicked and what makes them stumble. I will wipe humanity off the land, says Adonai. I will stretch out my hand over Yehuda and all those living in Jerusalem. I will wipe every remnant of Baal from this place, the idol-serving priests and even their names, those worshiping heaven's army on the roofs, and those who worship and swear by Adonai, but also swear by Malcolm as well, those who turned away from following Adonai and those who haven't sought Adonai or consulted him at all. Keep silent before Adonai Elohim, for the day of Adonai is near. Adonai has prepared a sacrifice. He has set apart those he has invited. When the time comes for Adonai's sacrifice, I will punish the leaders and the sons of the king and also those who dress in foreign clothes. On the same day I will also punish all who jump over the threshold to fill the house of their master with violence and deceit. Also on that day, says Adonai, a cry will be heard from the fish gate, wailing from the city's second quarter, and a loud crash from the hills. Wail, wail, you who live down in the hollow, because all the merchants are destroyed, all who trade with silver are ruined. Almost sounds like right now, just a wee bit, doesn't it? When that time comes, I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and punish those who are smug and thick like wine, left too long on its dregs, who say to themselves, Adonai will do nothing, neither good or bad. For this their wealth will be plundered, their houses will be destroyed. Yes, they will build houses, but not live in them. They will plant vineyards, but not drink the wine. The great day of Adonai is near, near and coming quickly. Hear the sound of the day of Adonai. When it's here, even a warrior will cry bitterly. That day is a day of fury, a day of trouble and distress, a day of waste and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick fog, a day of the shofar and of the battle cry, against the fortified cities and against the high towers on the city walls. I will bring such distress on the people that they will grope their way like the blind because they have sinned against Adonai. Their blood will be poured out like dust and their bowels like dung. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. For on the day of Adonai's fury, the whole of his judgment will make an end, a horrible end, of all those living in the land. Gather together, gather yourselves, nation devoid of shame, before the decree takes effect and the day comes when one passes like chaff, before Adonai's fierce anger comes on you. Before the day of Adonai's anger comes on you, seek Adonai, all you humble in the land, you who exercise his justice, seek righteousness, seek humility, that you might be hidden on the day of Adonai's anger. In other words, when he says, gather together, nation devoid of shame, surrounding areas, surrounding peoples will also suffer. And in truth, they did, under the hand of the Assyrians and under the hand of the Babylonians, in turn, 120, 130, 140 years apart. Because the campaigns are plural, we have this date for the fall of Assyria, which is, Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, Israel, and we have a date for the fall of Jerusalem, the capital of the southern kingdom, Judah, But the truth is the Assyrians are campaigning across the land before Samaria falls. There's more than one campaign. In fact, there's more than one Assyrian king involved in campaigning across the landscape over a period of years before the final end comes. And the same is true. There are at least 3 campaigns against Jerusalem before it falls. But through all of this, God is sending messages. And he has been sending messages. And he keeps sending messages. And to this day, he sends a message. Let everyone who is thirsty come. He still sends his message. So the collect of the day, Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. God's people said amen and hallelujah. I often use the phrase, when the playwright walks on the stage, the play is over. And none among God's chosen begs for the playwright to walk on the stage if they care for those who are not yet his people. Oh, I may yearn to see him, but to yearn for the story to end and judgment to fall upon all. No, no, oh Lord, tarry as long as possible. What was Abraham's prayer over Sodom? If you could just find 10. If you could, would you spare the city if you could just find 10? For he did not want destruction to come, but the Lord could find none. And so it came. Well, we came through the story of the Noah covenant, the Abraham covenant, and now the Mosaic covenant. We left the people kind of at the precipice of the journey into the promised land when, as it seems, we met so long ago. And while it has been, let's see, we met on the 3rd, correct? I was sick on the 10th. Somebody with a key was sick on the 17th. And so it's the 24th. And so it's been 3 weeks. So it seems like forever. So on the threshold of the promised land, here the children of Israel, the 12 tribes, the great nation, the people, the Hebrew children, are gathered on what's called the plains of Moab. We call it the east bank of the Jordan River. And there on the east bank, they stand. The book of Deuteronomy, which is actually the name we get from the Septuagint translation in Greek. It's not the Hebrew word. The word we get, what we get from that, is that the word is really to tell the story again, to repeat the words, literally to repeat the words. And Deuteronomy is a recitation, in a sense, on the plains of Moab by, handy to be in your library where you could pull books off the shelf and use them, where Joshua stands to deliver to the people the sermons. And Deuteronomy is a long, ongoing reminder sermon there as they await going across into the land. Joshua has come through a long life. He is not a young or middle-aged man. He, like Moses, is an old man, but still, like Moses, a very vibrant, vital man. And he is going to lead them. He is the one who has been appointed to lead them into the promised land, and he will serve as their military commander. That is, he will be the architect of their strategies, and he will be an administrator, the judge in a sense, over the division of the land among the tribes and the clans. And then he is also given, upon the death of Moses, an additional task. It's really a role. It's a role almost, it's a role not of priest, but as preacher. He is given the role of preacher, call it that. This book of the law shall not depart of your mouth, out of your mouth, the Lord commands Joshua in Joshua 1:8. You shall meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. And so throughout the time where Joshua is the leader, he interpreted the law to them. He read it publicly many times to remind them of the terms of their relationship, the covenant that God made with them, and their obligations as well as their blessings. And he also read their promises to them and the commandments that they were to follow. And he would speak the words of God that interpreted historical events in terms of the people's obedience or disobedience, occasionally accompanied with a fresh judgment or a fresh guidance. Joshua 1:17. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, the people responded, so we will obey you. So this interpreting what happens, what has happened and what does happen, and what will happen in terms of the obedience and the disobedience of a covenant people before their holy God, is going to be the prophetic definition, the definition of the prophetic office, which is really the proclamation office of God's truth throughout all of the prophets, which we will get to before we are finished tonight. We won't get to all of them. We'll get started on the prophets before we get finished tonight. And that book sits right there because it's a great summary to get to quickly. And as I often reference such things, I'll just show you real fast while I'm here. Because I'm proud. It's probably my proudest possession. This is my grandfather's Bible. Hold it to the camera closely. You see how it was rebound with these thongs? He hand bound it himself. It was so worn and so broken down that he had to bind it himself. And what did he do? When he bound it, he wound up binding songs in it. The old rugged cross is bound up in it. A tract on life in the spirit is bound up in it. There are bank deposit notes bound up in it. But it was so worn and so used, and it is a great treasure. Bound up in Leviticus, and I can't get it out. It's something he cut out of a writing, that are all the definitions of sanctify, to be sanctified, to sanctify. Sanctify as a noun, a verb, an adverb, and so forth. And you know, that's just something that's special to me. It sits right on top of my Greek New Testament. And what that really means is that I don't read that Greek New Testament all the time. That's what that really means. Okay, so here on the plains of Moab, Joshua has gathered the people, and he will do some things that echo Moses. He will deliver the law again. He will write on stone tablets. He will stand, and God will part the waters of the Jordan, and they will cross over on dry land. Sound familiar? Right? Seems like it's a chapter right out of the Mosaic story. When we come to this story about the Promised Land, about what we might call the conquest, a lot of scholars call it the conquest. It might be better to call it an occupation, because some parts of it they conquer, and some parts of it they occupy and share with the people who live there. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. There is this constant, unending emphasis in the story of the conquest, the story of Joshua, and yes, in the repetitions and recitations of Deuteronomy, on the land. We talked about the importance of the land in a previous session. I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But it is just pervasive, always there. And the other thing that comes through over and over and over is that prophetic declaration and interpretation that says, to prosper, you must be obedient to the law of God. And if you are disobedient to the law of God, his commands to us, if you do not keep faith with the covenant, then you will suffer great loss. So Joshua is the first prosperity gospel preacher. No. It's a little different, of course, because there is no term for grace in his message, even though the reality exists. There's one other thing that comes through really big, and it's in, and I'm going back to Dvarim, chapter 12. Dvarim, chapter 12. We got verses 1 and 2. You got it? Deuteronomy, Dvarim. 1 and 2. Here are the laws and rulings you are to observe and obey in the land of Adonai, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess as long as you live on earth. You must destroy all the places where the nations you are dispossessing serve their gods, whether on high mountains, hills, or under some leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their standing stones to pieces, burn up their sacred poles completely, and cut down the carved images of their gods. Exterminate their name, that points back to those false gods. Exterminate their name from that place. The command of God, Deuteronomy 12, which Joshua delivers to the people, is not exterminate all the people. It is exterminate everything that would compete with me. Destroy everything that would become me. Get rid of every trace of anything that would be worshipped other than me. In all of those lands, so when they approached the Gibeonites, who surrender and say, spare us and let us live with you, and they do, they still don't spare the Gibeonites, gods, temples, shrines, so forth. They can't. So Joshua leads them into the promised land, across on dry land, roughly 400 BC. By doing your timeline, you already know that there's more than one date for everything, isn't there? It seems. Every prior the time of Saul and David, there are at least two different dates, and they don't at all look quite the same, do they? They can look a few hundred years apart. So I'm going to use the idea that the Exodus was roughly 1446. That's just a catch-all idea, and that the time of the conquest is about 1406, somewhere in there. The texts seem to make clear that the time of crossing the Jordan and campaigning to take the promised land, or to occupy the promised land, lasts about 7 years. And it's accomplished under the leadership of a man who is, by any standard, old, but not weak, not infirm, and he's one of those people who ages really well. You know, everybody knows somebody who, you can't possibly be that old, is what you think when you see them and you listen to them, right? You get somebody like that? How could you be that old? No, you can't be that old. Surely not. Well, he's one of those. And so he's going to continually bring back to them, through this recitation of what we call the Deuteronomic law, if you will. He's going to bring back to them again and again the significance of Torah. What have we got? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? So Deuteronomy is the 5th book. And so the 5 are, in a sense, completed by it. And that's Torah. It's the law. It's the giving of all that God has brought to them in covenant relationship, and in all that God expects of them, and all that God has promised to do for them. So that's Torah. That's the law. And I'm on slide number 8. Remember, I sent you a note yesterday that said download the new one, because there's several new slides, and that's where I am right now. Here's where the new ones are. So the Torah is the law. The Mishnah is the oral traditions. They are eventually published as a collection about 200 years after Jesus. 170 years to 200 years after Jesus. The Mishnah supplements, complements, clarifies, and systematizes all the laws of the Torah. For example, there is in the Torah a law about dispossessing a rebellious son. The problem is that there is no definition of what rebellious is. There is no definition of process. There is no explanation of method. There is no explanation of context. And there is no provision for a repentant son to be restored. And so, over the many, many centuries, especially from the time of the exile to a couple hundred years after Jesus, that 600-year period, from about the end of the Old Testament, what we call Malachi, at 400 years until Jesus, and then about 200 more years into the church era. In that 600 years, the development of the synagogue as the center of Jewish life and of what we call rabbinical Judaism takes all of these oral traditions that have grown up among the people down through the generations and the ages and has turned it into a complete codification of all of the explanations of Torah. Because the example I gave you is one, actually many. And where one might not be needed, they made one anyway. And so, you'll pardon me, I've got a message here. Okay, that's James just telling me about process tonight when I'm done. It just dawned on me what it was. So you've got Torah and you've got Mishnah. Now, there is a Mishnah. This is where it gets really fun. There is a Mishnah, and there are many of those, and the Mishnah, and there's one of those. The Mishnah is made up of the Halakha, which is the rules and interpretations or the behavioral ethics, such as the example I gave, out of the Torah. So it's all of the commentary that is ethical application, all of the rules from the Torah. And then there is the Agadah, which are the theological issues of the Torah. And the truth is, when you get people in a rabbinical school together and you start arguing various Mishnahs, which are a Mishnah, is a teaching. Literally, it's a teaching. And the Mishnah is the teaching on the law. So you get them together and you start into a series of debates and arguments, and Rabbi so-and-so said this and Rabbi so-and-so said that. And they begin to have a debate. Sometimes the line on what is halakha and what is agadah can be murky, because you're involved in theological issues of providence of God while you're talking about a behavioral ethic all at the same time. But the Mishnah is a series of Mishnahs, teachings, on the Halakha and on the Agadah. And like I said, the two are intertwined. Now it gets better. The Mishnah is the main text of the Talmud. The Talmud, that's the main text. It has the Halakha and the Agadah. The Talmud has 6 sections. They are called orders. So there are 6 orders to the Talmud. Each order is divided into a tractate, into various tractates. Each tractate is divided into chapters. Each paragraph in a chapter is also a Mishnah, a teaching. Okay? So all of the chapters are Mishnahs, and all of this gets stacked up. The Talmud is comprised of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which is the commentary, get this, on the Mishnah. Don't you love it? Now, all of this gets written down and codified over the first 500 years of the church or Christian era, roughly from the time of Jesus to about 500 AD. But these oral traditions that comprise what is written down as the Mishnah, which becomes the centerpiece of the Talmud, in which the Gemara is also put, which is a common series of commentaries on the Mishnah, that gives you an idea of why Jesus was talking about the laws and the rules made by men versus those made by God, because these oral traditions were already very widespread in the time of Jesus. The rabbinical system was about 400 years old at this point. The rabbinical schools and the commentaries and the writings of Mishnahs by the scribes was long underway by the time Jesus came. And so there are many Mishnahs on the Torah. Okay? And so when Jesus starts going at the scribes and the Pharisees, there's a story behind that. You've already got part of the story. All of the Mishnahs are the human codification of all the details about each one of the laws in the Torah. So in Jesus' time, there were all kinds of Mishnahs that had the force of law about what constituted work or not work on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. And that certainly comes up in an instance where he feeds his disciples because they're hungry on Shabbat. He feeds them in the field. And the other part of the story is that the Prushim existed prior to Jesus' arrival. Prushim is what we call Pharisees. The Hasidim, the holy ones, became the Prushim, who became what in the Roman world came to be called the Pharisees by Greek speakers and Latin speakers. These are what today we would call Orthodox Jews. And they believed that all pious Jews should keep the Mishnah in all of its parts without fail, and the Torah without fail. And you had to keep all of that to stand blameless and holy before God. So when you look at that and the fact that you have this, it's a minority of the population, but it is the most politically active, politically astute, and dogmatic section of society, the holy ones, the Pharisees. And they expected everybody to keep the Mishnah in all of its pieces, as well as the Torah. And when you put all of that together, now you understand the context of why Jesus at times really went to battle with the Pharisees and the scribes. And what's the scribes' job? The Mishnahs. It's not collected yet into the Mishnah, but it might as well be, because there are so many of them that the scribes are keeping, and that the rabbis and the scribes are teaching and transmitting to the people, and the Pharisees are insisting that everyone obey to the last mark of the writing by the scribes, right down to the last detail, in other words. So when Jesus says, you lay too heavy a burden on the people, that's a nice modern paraphrase. Now you know why. Today, conservative and Reform Jews do not see the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the Gemara as authoritative to daily living. Ultra-Orthodox Jews do. In my neighborhood, where there is a Chabad, and it's spelled like it should be said Chabad, that is one branch of Orthodoxy. The Lubavitchers started Chabads in the United States and around the world. And so the only truly Orthodox community in Nashville is in not far from my house. And so if you go to certain streets on a Saturday morning, you will see various Orthodox families on their way to synagogue or having left synagogue if you wait late enough. Um, and you will see that they are walking and that they are dressed appropriately. The men wear their hats, they have their fringes, they have their phylacteries, and so forth. But there are a number of synagogues in Nashville, and there's only one where you will see any of that, and that's the one in my neighborhood. So, knowing all of those details 10 years from now doesn't matter. But for your teaching and preaching and understanding of reading the New Testament record, knowing how this comes together and it creates this whole body of detailed explanation that comes to carry a weight of requirement for the average person in Judea and in Galilee in the time of Jesus does matter. And when you preach St. Paul's the proclamation that I have kept the law, and according and by the standard of the law am blameless, we know he comes out of a particular rabbinical school that he studied in. Then you have this question of, is he referencing that he kept Torah, or did he keep Torah and Mishnah? Which is saying something. I believe he thought that he had come as close as a human being could come to keeping Torah and all of the then existing Mishnahs. Remember, Mishnah wasn't codified for another couple of hundred years into the Mishnah. In fact, almost slide 12, the Talmud, which has the Mishnah and the Gemara, was formalized as the Palestinian Talmud in 375 AD, and the Babylonian Talmud in about 500 AD. When the exiles began to come back to their homeland of Judah and what would become Galilee, where the northern tribes had largely been carried off, destroyed, ceased to exist as a separate people, where other peoples had been settled, and there were what would be called half-Jews, Sumerians, for example. They weren't necessarily half-Jew, it's just that they weren't Jews. Whether they were 1/10th Jew or 1/20th Jew or 1024th Jew or 2/3 Jew or whatever, they weren't Judean Jews. They therefore were considered half-Jews. And they were considered to be not of the people. But when the people came back to those lands, some didn't come back. Some stayed in Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq. Some never left. And there were synagogues and Jews and communities and rabbis and rabbinical schools in that land that never left. And so out of that comes a Babylonian Talmud. You have those who go back to what the Romans will term Palestina. That's where we get Palestinian from. It's just simply a Latin term the Romans threw on it. It came out of nothing generic to the populations who lived there. It was a name imposed upon them by the Romans on the land. Because the land, you may recall, was divided up into ethnarchies and tetrarchies and little kingdoms and so forth. And so they drew on the map and they put Palestina on it to define a geographical area, not a political area. But there's a third group. There's a group that escapes at the time of conquests, when the later conquests, when the Babylonians come and take Jerusalem. There is a group that has escaped to Egypt. And there a whole nother school will grow up. And eventually it is the Egyptian, and other people will come there down through the generations from both Palestine and from the Babylonian diaspora. And that, what we call the Alexandrian school, because it's centered around Alexandria, Egypt, which was the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. So you'll have an Alexandrian Jewish school. They're the ones who will translate the Hebrew into the Greek and create what we call the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Then you have the Palestinians, Jews, and then you have the Babylonian Jews. You have three great centers of Judaism in the 400 years between the return, say from Ezra, Nehemiah, so forth. From then to the time of Jesus, you've got these three different centers of Judaism that have grown up. After Jesus' resurrection and ascension, over the next 130 years, there will be rebellions in Judea against Roman authority. And two noteworthy ones, but three that actually occurred. And by the time the third one's concluded, the Romans have leveled the Temple Mount. All that's left is some of the foundation wall of Herod's Grand Temple Plaza, which is now called the Wailing Wall. The city is in absolute ruins, will have to be rebuilt under the Byzantine emperors of the New Rome of Constantinople. And those three centers will become diffused all over the Roman world, because the Romans at this point don't want a concentration of Jews the size of a nation anywhere. They've had it. And so we get what's called the Great Diaspora, where Jews are scattered from Spain to Turkey to the borders of Germany, down all the way to Ethiopia and to the gates of India. But prior to that, you have where we are tonight. That's a digression to give you this picture of how this ebbs and flows and moves across the history of the Old Testament and the New. And it came about because I wanted to explain how the various teachings all layer Torah and all the Mishnahs that were done, and that's what Jesus is tackling at times. But those eventually get codified and become the Talmud. And that's quite a lot. According to Midrash, which is a teaching, the forcible conquest and bloody battles reported in the rest of the book of Joshua are only part of the story. Oftentimes, in the last 150 years, under the atomistic, taken apart into little pieces, forms of criticism that we've discussed at other times. the focus becomes so much upon the actions that are looked upon in the last 200 years as, how can you justify killing all of these inhabitants of this city? Or did that really happen? And so forth. That gets to be so much in the forefront of the various pieces that are being analyzed that it's sometimes easy to forget that if you read the story as a whole, that's only a piece of the story. Because when the Hebrews approached a city, town, city, the residents are warned and they're given a choice. They can leave. You can make your own exile and move. They can make peace with Israel and accept Israel's God and accept the destruction of their public shrines and live side by side. Or they can declare war upon Israel and resist. Like I said earlier, the Gibeonites took advantage of this and made peace. And so, when they are later attacked by some of those who choose to make war, the Israelites actually defend the Gibeonites. It's in Joshua 9. There is, in our day, an echo of this idea in the understanding of the Pashtunwali, which is the law of hospitality and protection practiced by the Pashtun tribes of Afghanistan and Pakistan. Understand that the border really doesn't mean much between those two places to this people. The vast majority of the Taliban are Pashtun. When they take anyone in, their Pashtunwali, which is their code, demands that they protect and defend that person even if it costs their life. If you watch the movie Lone Survivor, you'll see one special forces or Navy, maybe a Navy SEAL, who is taken in, injured, into a village, a Pashtun village, and they fight against fellow Pashtuns who don't, and they fight to defend this man. And the whole battle that they're having is over the fact that they've taken this man in, and so they're obligated to protect him. It's this same basic idea. If you make peace with us and we take you in and we are agreed, then we become allies and we will protect you. We will fight for you. So when you look at the book of Joshua, there are three sections really. Chapters 2 through 12 describe the military campaigns. But there are 24 chapters. So only half the book is about the military campaigns. The first campaigns are against Jericho and Ai, and they are to conquer the Central Hill Country. The Central Hill Country is the linchpin of the Promised Land geographically. When you come off the plain of Moab and you come across the river on a low bluff above the river, very, very defensible area that guards all of the roads and trails that would lead up to the city of David. Eventually, at this time it was just Salem, Yes, Salem is where David will build Jerusalem, and Salem is where Melchizedek blessed Abraham, who brought a tithe um, to Melchizedek of Salem. There has always been, in from prehistory forward, some sort of settlement there. Why there? It kind of bisects the geography of that land, and whoever controls the central highland there, it's going to be really hard to keep them from having an influence over all of what we call the Promised Land. And so they take Jericho, which is the door to Jerusalem. For there, basically, you climb. It's about 3,000 feet up in a matter of miles, and boom, you're just about there. And then chapter 10 is about them going south to conquer the southern hill country. And then chapter 11 is about going north to capture the North Hill country. And if you look at those campaigns, you'll see that the end of the campaigning, according to chapter 11, if you look at a map and you look at where they've been, you'll see that essentially they finish not terribly far from Shechem. And what happened there? God told Abram the very first time, I will give your descendants this land. And Abram built an altar to Yahweh, to Adonai. And that ends that part of the book. The book of Joshua seems to make this case for a rapid, successful conquest of all the promised land by Israel in that 7 years. Boom. And then you turn the page from chapter 24 of Joshua, and you get into the book of Judges, and you go, this doesn't seem to compute. Because Judges pictures a struggle that goes on and on and on between the people of God, and they're obeying him, and then they're turning away from him, and then they're being punished. So it's the way it's interpreted. And then God raising up a champion who would be called a judge, who would restore their fortunes, and they would worship God, and then they would begin to fall away, and they would disobey God, and you just rinse and repeat over generations. So Judges pictures this struggle over generations, and Judges is full of tribal warfare at at almost a family kind of level, an extended family kind of level. It's almost down to the Hatfields and McCoys level of fighting and conflict. And people say, well, how can this be? I thought the land was conquered in 7 years. Joshua got it all done. No. Remember that people were given a choice, right? You can leave, you can stay on our terms, or you can fight, right? Well, there were people who stayed. And there were also people who stayed whom they did not challenge. And the truth is that this 7-year conquest of everything and this generational struggle to actually own what's supposed to be ours can happen. You can have a sudden conquest and a long struggle in the same place. And you can make the claim that the mission's accomplished, and the mission goes on, and we've seen it in the last 20 years. Because the United States and some various allied groups invaded Iraq in 2003. In 3 months, man, it was mission accomplished. We've taken the place. And then what happened? Well, we hear that it was an insurgency. Well, what you had was a land in which there are many tribes and many sheikhs and many divisions over religion, both large divisions between Shia and Sunni, but you also have divisions within those, and you have a lot of tribal warfare, and you have a struggle to resist an outsider while also trying to assert your own authority over a certain given area. And so we had a rapid success, and then we had a slow burn for several years in one location after another, and sometimes several of them at the same time, but not in all of them all the time. The insurgency did not happen everywhere in Iraq all the time. Moved around, and it was here and there. It had much the same picture as the picture we get in Judges. Some things, the more they change, the more they stay the same. So this is why we have two books that seem so different. Because you could say that they are the two pieces that eventually lead to the great kingdom that will be the Davidic kingdom, the great kingdom of David and Solomon. These struggles by the 12 tribes of Israel have to happen in all of their localities for there to be eventually a unified nation with the ability to assert a unified authority over most of what God had told Moses his people should inhabit. So, I want us to read from the record Joshua 24, and Deborah, I want you to read from Joshua 24, and Amy, if you would read from Deuteronomy 30. We'll do Debbie first. And these are, in a sense, the great peroration of Joshua's story with the people of Israel before we come into that mess, that tribal mess that is Judges. Okay, so let's read Joshua 24.
Okay. And do you want me to do verses 15 through 27? Okay. If it seems bad to you to serve Adonai, then choose today whom you are going to serve. Will it be the gods your ancestors served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorite in whose land you are living? As for me and my household, we will serve Adonai. The people answered, Far be it from us that we would abandon Adonai to serve other gods, because it is Adonai our God who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from a life of slavery, and did those great signs before our eyes, and preserved us all along the way we traveled, and among all the peoples we passed through. And it was Adonai who drove out from ahead of us all the peoples, the Amorite living in the land. Therefore we too will serve Adonai, for he is our God. Yehoshua said to the people, You cannot serve Adonai, because he is a holy God, a jealous God, and he will not forgive you your crimes and sins. If you abandon Adonai and serve foreign gods, he will turn, doing you harm and destroying you after he has done you good. But the people said to Jehoshua, "No, but we will serve Adonai." Jehoshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen Adonai to serve him." They answered, "We are witnesses." Now Jehoshua urged, "Put away the foreign gods you have among you, and turn your hearts to Adonai, the God of Israel." The people answered Jehoshua, "We will serve Adonai, our God. We will pay attention to what he says." So Jehoshua made a covenant with the people that day, laying down for them laws and rulings there in the Shechem. Jehoshua wrote these words in the book of the Torah of God. Then he took a big stone and set it up there under the oak next to the sanctuary of Adonai. Jehoshua said to all the people, "See, this stone will be a witness against us, because it has heard all the words of Adonai which he said to us. Therefore it will be a witness against you in case you deny your God."
Yeah. Okay. Deuteronomy 30.
30 verses 15 through 20, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Look, I am presenting you today with, on the one hand, life and good, and on the other hand, death and evil, in that I am ordering you today to love Adonai your God, to follow his ways, and to obey his mitzvot, regulations, and rulings. For if you do, you will live and increase your numbers, and Adonai your God will bless you in the land you are entering in order to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away, if you refuse to listen, if you are drawn away to prostrate yourselves before other gods and serve them, I am announcing to you today that you will certainly perish. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call on heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have presented you with life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life so that you will live, you and your descendants, by loving Adonai your God, paying attention to what he says and clinging to him, for that is the purpose of your life. On this depends the length of time you will live in the land Adonai swore he would give to your ancestor Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov.
Do you see the similarity of the theme in both of those? They're essentially saying exactly the same thing. What we heard in Joshua, the pericope there, makes a point of that they are to put away the false gods that are among them. Remember that their task was to eradicate false gods wherever they went. They didn't even get that done. And so the call of Joshua as the preacher, as the prophet, which was his greatest office, far greater than being that of commander, is to call the people to fidelity to Adonai. That's quite a story, quite a picture. And he has brought the people to, we're here. We have this possession. We are divided up into our settlements. Our tribes have their territories. We are a part of the land now. And Judges describes the practical application of this conquest theology to their story. And it is a repetitive rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat kind of story. Where people sin, great suffering comes upon them from various sources, usually from the people around them. They cry to God for help and for mercy. He delivers them through a chosen champion, say Deborah. They are freed from their oppression. They are called upon to honor God, to keep the covenant, and then they sin again, and they suffer again, and they cry for mercy, and God sends their deliverance, and they are free, and then they sin again, and you just rinse and repeat. It's quite a story, but there's a long story, because when you come down to what we call the end, it's not a short end of the story of the period of the judges. We come to Shmuel, Shmuel 1, in fact, Samuel 1. And chapters 4 through 7 describe a period of great suffering, long apostasy, deep sorrow, anguish, and Shmuel becomes the champion caller, the champion preacher to the people. And in chapter 4, in fact, it begins, so the word of Shmuel came to all Israel. Israel went out to fight the Plishtim, setting up camp at Ebenezer. And the Plishtim drew up in battle formation, and the battle was fierce, and Israel was defeated. There's this long story of the Israelites being defeated by the Philistines, being defeated severely, of backing off and licking their wounds, of trying to identify their problem, of coming to the conclusion that they had ignored God. So if they would put the Ark of the Covenant in the forefront of the battle, the presence of God would go before them, and they would be victorious, because the presence of God would sweep their enemies before him. This did not happen overnight. It took a long time. But eventually they draw up in battle array again, and the Philistines, the story goes on to say, are terrified, because the Israelites are so noisy, so excited, and so convinced of their victory that they are shouting out about their victory. They are singing victory songs. They are beating on everything that makes noise. And it sounds like the Battle of the Bands on steroids, coming across the mountains to do battle with the Philistines. The Israelites have put all of their faith in this physical manifestation of God, the Ark of the Covenant. And they go out to do battle, and they not only lose, it's worse than the last time. In fact, it's so bad that the slaughter is so great that what's left of them run home and hide. And the Philistines take the borderlands that were in dispute, and Israel wails and mourns and licks their wounds, and Samuel rails at them about what they've done wrong. What have they done wrong? Well, a lot of things they've done wrong. They've lost their identity. The pervasiveness of sin has destroyed their understanding of their long-standing pervasiveness of sin has destroyed their understanding of their covenant place. They have lost their understanding of a real covenant relationship or commitment to God. They therefore came to this idea that the Ark of the Covenant was like a religious talisman, and wherever it went, the presence of God automatically went, which means they had God in a box. And I'm sure that you have either heard or spoken, preached, or taught about the dangers of trying to put God in a box. The Ark of the Covenant's a box, but God's not confined to a box. And unfortunately, they had totally lost all sense of the fact that it was representative of the presence of God, not the guarantee of the presence of God. And therefore, they had their terrible comeuppance. Now, the interesting part of the story is that God proves that he's perfectly capable of taking care of himself and of his representative physical presence, the Ark of the Covenant. Things go so crazy for the Philistines wherever they have this ark that finally they bring it to the border and put it on the other side of the border and say, please get this out of here. It's killing us. We don't want anything to do with your God. We don't want anything to do with your stuff. Leave us alone. Take your God in a box. In other words, God was proving to the Philistines he was greater than their God, and he was proving to the Israelites that God is not limited to their limited understanding. He is perfectly capable of fighting his own battle, winning his own war, and accomplishing his own purpose in his own way and his own time. It's quite a lesson, and Samuel gets to preach some wonderful sermons over this. And out of this, finally, it's a long story. You can read the whole thing. And in fact, you can preach it sometime, teach it, whatever age group you're working with or setting. There are so many pieces of this story that preach and transfer to New Testament gospel application that it's amazing. Just starting with the whole idea of God in a box. And finally, there comes a spiritual renewal of sorts under Shmuel's preaching and prodding. And the people come back to at least the beginnings of an understanding of their place before God. But have they done this? We will follow God. No sooner have they done this than in the very next chapter you read that they reject God as king. They want a king. Give us a king like everybody else has. Please give us a king. We want to be like other peoples. We don't have a king. And the text specific. God consents that he will appoint them a king. Understand, they don't pick a king. And it's not God's idea. And it's not his perfect plan. But he consents to seek. He will give them what they seek. He consents. And this is the theological difference that exists. Now I'm going to read from you from 1 Shmuel chapter 8, verses 11 through 18. More reading. Don't worry. Everybody gets to read tonight. Shmuel said, here's the kind of rulings your king will make. He will draft sons. He will draft your sons and assign them to take care of his chariots, to be his horsemen, and to be bodyguards running ahead of his chariots. He will be in charge of 1,000 or 50, plowing his fields, gathering his harvest, making his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters, makers, cooks, and bakers. He will expropriate your fields, vineyards, and olive groves, the very best of your stuff. He will take it and hand them over to his servants. He will take tax of your crops and vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He will take your male and female servants, your best young men, and your donkeys, and make them work for him. 10% tax of your flocks. You will become his servants. When that happens, you will cry out on account of your king, whom you yourselves But when that happens, Adonai will not hear you. Ouch! Ouch! That sounds like big government. It is big government for their time. They're begging for centralized power. And he's telling them, you really don't want that, do you? If you insist, you can have it. Here's what it's going to be like. And he tells them what it's going to be like. And that they're going to lose many things that they consider their own, and many things that they consider to have as their own privileges, or call it if you want. They wouldn't, because they had no concept of the idea, their rights. It's kind of chilling when you read it, what he's going to take from them. He's going to take not just some of their stuff. He's going to take the nearest and the dearest, the greatest and the best from them. God says, if you want a king, this is going to happen. And what do? Yeah, that's what we want. They insist. That's what we want. So they will get what they want. But God does not establish a king the way every other nation establishes a king. There's a process that is different from all the peoples around them. For their God is not like anybody around them. So, at the point where the people say, this is what we want, they're in a great assembly of the leaders of the people, and God sends them home. Huh? Sends them home. They are not going to go into a political bickering over who's going to be the leader of what. God's not going to have that. There are going to be no kingmakers. There's no scheming. There's no horse trading. If you'll support my son, then I'll give you 2 daughters. It's not going to be any of that kind of stuff. That's what the people around them do. God will choose. And so he instructs Samuel to anoint Saul in secret. And if you're looking at your text and you go right over, we were on chapter 8. Chapter 9's on the facing page. And if you'll flip one page, Lindsay, one verse there. Chapter 9, verse 21 says what? You've got your microphone off.
I thought I clicked it. There we go.
Hey.
Oh, sorry. Shaul replied, I am only a man from Benjamin, the smallest tribe in Israel, and my family is the least important of all the families in the tribe of Benjamin. Why are you saying such a thing to me?
Interesting, isn't it? So God has Shmuel anoint Saul, who is every bit the vision of a king. He stands a head taller than everybody else in the assembly. The text says that he's beautiful to look at. He is the absolute picture of a magnificent, the magnificent male, and physically stands out. But you'll notice right off the bat, that's the only way that he stands out. God chooses a king from the smallest of the tribes. In fact, this tribe of Benjamin is terribly small. And early on, it gets attached to the tribe of Judah, which will eventually just absorb it. And the tribe of Judah will be where we get the word Jew from. And the other 10 tribes will cease to exist. So God chooses a man who, when pointed out in the crowd, is hiding from the smallest tribe and the least important family. That too will preach. So then the people are called into assembly, and there is a casting of lots. And the lot falls to Saul, and Samuel sends everyone home. And then, to make sure that all the people will get on a page, God will stage manage the deliverance of his chosen king to his people. And when you go into chapter 11, you'll find that Saul has to come to the deliverance of the people of one of the other tribes in the north of the land. Word comes down that they are under assault from neighbors, and Saul chooses to gather some people and go to their defense and wins a victory on their behalf. So he has gone from the least of the tribes, he has gone to the land of one of the large tribes, he has gone to do battle for one of the clans of one of the other tribes. Remember, they're not a united people. And he is acclaimed as a great and fair and good man who has come to the aid of people who are not even his kinsmen. And he will become now the king, in fact, as the people believe that he is a man of unusual qualities. So what God, Adonai, has established in this process is that Israel's king is to be ruled by God's Spirit, because in that story right there, the Spirit of God comes upon Saul. He established that Israel's king is to be God's servant, because the king is anointed by God's prophet or preacher, and he is selected by God's lot. There's a process to that has a long standing in the stories of God's people in the Old Testament. And he is finally shown to be a champion of God's people, in fact. So Israel's king really isn't Saul at all. Saul or whoever is always going to be the earthly viceroy of Adonai, or is going to be in rebellion against Adonai. Sadly enough, a lot of the kings who will follow will be in rebellion against Adonai. But those who are not will essentially, while they're called king, and while they have power, and while they exert power, none more so than David and Solomon, nonetheless, they shall still be subject to the law of God. They shall still be subject to the judgment of God, and they shall still have to listen to the chosen preacher of God and of God's truth and judgment for their lives. Therefore, Israel's king is still Adonai. And for that, they pay a very heavy price to the earthly king. You know, that leads you to the old statement, be careful what you wish for. So, I want to stop there for about 3 minutes, okay? Take about 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to do that, and I'll be right back. All righty. So, while everybody's getting themselves together to come back, my next thing is just to go around the table in a sense of speaking. Is there something, one thing in that kind of got your attention, surprised you, um, made you look at it again? Or is there something in your reading, your study, and in the writing you've done so far that just seemed to stick out to you, speak to you, or get your attention? Remember to turn your microphone on. There you go.
There we go. What I keep seeing is just people forget who God is when things are going good. They wait till things get really bad before they cry out to Him again. And this is back before Christ. This is what, 2,000 years before Christ, or 1,400 years before Christ, and it's still going on today. It's just amazing to me how we forget to praise Him, and we forget to keep our eye on Him when things are going good. I know that sounds kind of weird, but with everything going with the COVID-19, this is another opportunity for people to come back to God. I mean, it's kind of like an awakening in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's basically it. I see the Old Testament tied into today.
Okay. There she is. There's another one. So the question, Amy, is in your reading, your writing, is there anything that kind of got your attention or spoke to you or stood out to you?
I have to think on that for a minute because I just got a text that Metro schools are closed through April 24th, so that's what's in my brain right now. So let me think on it for a second.
Yep. Yep.
I think
fine.
it's
Go ahead, Lindsay.
interesting. It's always interesting to me how this, similar to what Debbie said, the story just kind of comes back around. Not only the events that we see in the story of God through the Old Testament and then through the New Testament and in our world today, how people are acting, how God is moving, but even just even the places where things take place, where things happen. And I've never been to the Holy Land, but I just think that would be incredible to be there and even to know today's events, what's happening there, and just to be in that setting. Something I marked in my textbook here. It's not anything incredibly overarchingly profound, but when I was reading about Elijah, and I think this stuck out to me because I sing a song that speaks about very much to this idea of God whispering, and God spoke to Elijah through whisper. And that was kind of a new thing. And I think even in our minds, we get caught up in God speaking in certain ways, and yet He's not confined to that box like we just talked about. But I wrote in the margin here, God whispered to Elijah on the same mountain where he spoke thunderously to Moses. So he's in that same place again, speaking in a different way, just again and again, like coming to his people in a new way to try to get our attention again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've when you look at that, what you're talking about is an incredible patience.
And to speak to what you said earlier about, and even now we see people saying, "Come quickly, Lord," and that's one of those things that you kind of, this tension of where the hope that we have for an eternity in His presence, and all this stuff is gone. But I think of family members and friends who would also be, gone from that. That's they wouldn't experience that, and that burdens me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, like one of the things too that we touched on in the notes here and everything about the cyclical nature of the people's like sin, being defeated, crying out for help, repenting, coming back to God, sinning again. The whole cycle is exactly what they've always done. All through the desert, their journey in the desert, it was the constant cycle, and it's the constant cycle that we may even experience nowadays. Like how many times do we sometimes have to be like, oh my gosh, I've gotten so caught up in everything else, I need to refocus where my priorities are, where my heart is supposed to be focused. And it may look different because it's more kind of individual now rather than like as a whole people. But we still hit that cycle nowadays, and it's kind of just interesting because even after Christ, we still hit that cycle. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's just, and it's easy to look at the Israelites and be like, shouldn't they have learned by now? But then you're like, oh. Because, yeah, it's preaching to yourself,
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that. So.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw the S disappear. Sarah, are you there? I don't see the picture, but I saw the icon move. All right. Well, I'm going to pick up there. I was told as a youngster it was really important to start well, and it's really important to finish well. And as I got older, the quipster in me always wanted to ask, well, what about in between? Doesn't that matter too? It does, because what's in between tends to impact whether or not you finish well. And that was the answer to that. Sarah, everybody was in turn talking about something that in their study, their reading, the things you've written, so forth, something in this class that has in the last 3 weeks just kind of, oh yeah, and it's something you thought about, or it jumped out at you, or it spoke to you. Is there anything like that at all?
Yeah, I could hear and see all of y'all, and I was trying to talk and didn't realize you couldn't hear me.
No.
Basically, what Debbie and Lindsay and Amy all said, I am, I don't know that amazed is the right word, of the correlation between what we're talking about in the Old Testament now and what's going on today. I firmly believe that, God is saying, we need to pay attention. You cannot keep living the way that you want to live and live in sin and not, so I just find that so interesting to me. And I'm preaching on this, that, God is saying, pay attention, because, the time is coming that you're going to have to answer for your sins. And I think that that's where we are as a nation today.
And if you're talking about a nation, the founding generation, you can wrote and spoke at length on the subject of for a free people to be free, they had to have a well, they would have said a Christian morality. The morality that existed in their world. They strongly wrote and taught that the loss of a religious foundation would undermine individual and collective freedom. And that's an interesting thought. No need to go into it. It's just an interesting thought in light of what you collectively have been saying. Saul is anointed of God. The Spirit of God has moved upon him. He has done a great thing on behalf of the people. He begins well. But what God told the people was going to happen, that the king would take what the king wanted and they would be left with what they had left, began to happen. And as Saul slowly sets up court of a fashion and begins to operate, and he's king for many, 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 many years, he begins to show that old aphorism to be true, that power corrupts absolutely. He's never an absolute power, but he comes to think that he is. And the Israelites went down to do battle with the Philistines with the Ark of the Covenant in the front of them, with the totally mistaken belief that God was with them because they had the ark. Saul kept going forward, doing more and more of what he thought he wanted to do or should do, or impatiently chose to do, thinking that the blessing of God was upon him because he had been anointed. The story that comes through in Shmuel, the book, Samuel, shows that Saul continues to choose poorly under stress. His hiding when they are selecting him in the assembly and having to be pulled out of hiding to be presented to the people is a small window into his character. In the book, there are 4 particular events that are used to show how Saul more and more neglects cultivating a dependence upon the Spirit of God. And as I would say, preaching, beloved, we cultivate a spirit of knowing that we are dependent and hearing from God. You don't accidentally bump into being filled with the Spirit. Being full of God is not an accident. It does not happen against your will. You have to be cooperative, in agreement, and you pursue the heart of God. What Saul begins to not do more and more is pursue the heart of God. And I believe that one of the reasons goes to pains to say that David was a man after God's own heart is that it is drawing a contrast between the 2 men and their general spiritual tone, where Saul seems to slowly slide away through a series of choices. These choices are kind of incremental, and Saul doesn't really seem to be able to live up to it seems like his will or his spirit at times will buckle. Um, he's in a desperate place early in his reign, relatively speaking. He's in a desperate place against the Philistines. And he's called for Samuel to come and offer sacrifice to the Lord God, and before he does battle, and Samuel doesn't come, and Saul impatiently goes and makes the sacrifice himself, which is prohibited. It's forbidden. Um, the text that is given for this course, the author makes the point that they think it implies that Saul believes that the sacrificial ritual is the magic. Well, he hadn't been paying attention to the stories of putting the ark in front of the people and how that didn't work out either then. Years pass. Jonathan boldly provokes the enemy because he trusts in the Lord, and Saul consults the word of the Lord through his priests, and it's not the priest, but through his priest. And Jonathan hears it, and Saul tells the priest to stop communicating with God. And when he tells the priest to quit communicating with God, that's a telling sign. He puts a curse of fasting upon the people until I have been avenged of my enemies. Do you hear that it's all about me? Right there in the story. And then he's given a direct order from God, and he disobeys. And in 1 Samuel 15, Samuel confronts him. And, well, here are the bullet points. Don't you love those shows that say just the bullet points? Saul, acting ignorant of his sin, has set up a monument for himself. Saul greets Samuel, saying, "Blessed are you of the Lord, I've carried out the command of the Lord." Samuel confronts him that with the booty from confiscation that was saved for Saul's benefit, which is against God's command. Saul explains the best was supposed to be sacrificed to God. They argue. Saul seems to, I guess, be stressed. And Samuel says, "Why did you not obey?" And Saul says, "I did," but then he blames the people with taking some of the choices. And Samuel says, "To obey is better than sacrifice." Samuel says, "You have not obeyed God. Had you obeyed God, all would be well, but you haven't." And then Samuel ends their confrontation with, "God has rejected you from being the king." And so Saul jumps to a confession. "I sinned because I feared the people." He's making excuses. "Please pardon me." Samuel says, "No, you rejected the word of the Lord." Saul seizes Samuel's robe. Samuel proclaims, as his robe tears, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and given it to your neighbor who is better than you." And so Saul pleads, "I have sinned, but honor me now before the elders of the people and go back with me that I may worship the Lord your God." So this falling away becomes complete before his death. And it becomes all about him. And I would say that anyone in public life who is in office a long time, I don't care who they are, or what their office is, what their party affiliation is, or anything else. Anybody who has been in office a long time, usually loses their deep connection to the needs and the desires of the people, and it becomes more and more about preserving what they themselves have come to have and value for themselves. It's almost inevitable. I just think that's what I see. The greatest presidents in the history of the nation, by most of the standards of historians rating them, spent time away from political office in their years for whatever reasons, and came back to the office of the president, tended to make more of a mark than those who had marched through unhindered from political office to political office with no time in a political wilderness to speak of. Abraham Lincoln served one term in Congress, 2 years, and was defeated in running for office, and lived in private life for, 14 years before he was finally elected president. Franklin Roosevelt had been the governor of New York and had been a candidate for vice president in 1924. Is that right? It was 1920 maybe, and had been stricken with polio and spent several years in private life before he was finally elected governor of New York, either in 1928 or 1930. And in 1932, he was elected president. He had spent some years stricken with polio, among other people stricken with polio, seeking cures and seeking to recover and seeking to learn how to stand again with the assistance of the braces. Many of the best presidents had struggles before they came to the office. And I believe that illustrates that people who are in office and have the privilege of office unbroken for a long, long time have trouble, as did Saul, maintaining a sense of the benefit of the people as opposed to maintaining their own sinecures, their own benefits and privileges. And I think we see that over and over and over. And I really think that aspect of public life, I think that aspect of it is almost universal regardless of political philosophy. And so I'm a big believer that, let somebody serve for a little while and vote them out. In other words, I believe in term limits for everybody, Anyway, Saul would have done well to have been term limited instead of having a lifetime job. I think when we get to him, and we're not going to spend much time on him, Solomon might well have turned out better had he had a term limit about halfway through the time that he was actually king. David is a rare soul, but I think he probably would have been better off had he been term limited as well. So let's look at David. In other words, what I'm saying about all three of the kings of the unified people, all of them, as the years went by, fell into various troubles and traps. They're not the same. They are not the same. The effect on the nation is not the same. The sins of the men are not the same. Each one illustrates something different, and each one responds differently. But all of them, in the second half of their many years as king of the United Kingdom of Israel, they didn't do as well as they did in the first half of their time as king. So David is the second king anointed by Samuel. The truth is, he is trained from his youth to be the king, not trained by the king, not trained by his family, not trained by a great mentor. He is trained under the hand of Adonai, under the hand of Adonai Elohim. God keeps invading, impacting, and redirecting David's life in those many years when he is a servant of Saul, and then he becomes king for 7 years of just Judah and Benjamin. And his capital is at Hebron in the South Hill country. It takes 7 years from the time Saul dies and David comes to the throne of those two tribes for him to finally become acclaimed the king by the 10 northern tribes, whereupon he will move his capital to what will become known as the city of David, and he will name it Jerusalem. He is his entire time under the kingship of Saul loyal to Saul. When Saul is not loyal to him, when Saul seeks his life, he is still loyal to his king. That is an admirable quality that you could say he's admirable to a fault. But he is admirable to a fault in the hand of God. He says, I will not take the life of God's anointed. Saul was anointed of Samuel. He was anointed king by the will of God. He was chosen of God. He would not lift his hand against God's chosen. And there are two specific instances in the long story of David and Saul where he has ample opportunity to kill his nemesis and to proclaim himself king, and he refuses. And in each case, it almost costs him his life. He spends years on the run. His time on the run turns him into a fearsome tactician and strategist in the sense of a military commander, and gives him a remarkable understanding not only of the land in which he lives, but of working with the people as a military commander. Because what he really is, for all those years before he becomes proclaimed the king of the two southern tribes, he's really the leader of a guerrilla band. He's really an insurgent, except he's not an insurgent against his king. He fights on behalf of the people against their enemies in numerous cases. And he fights for Saul in numerous cases on behalf of the people. But he doesn't do much fighting that you could call selfish. And so he serves loyally until the day Saul falls on his sword, his own sword. God makes a covenant with David that he will build the house of David, and it will be forever. So if you go to 2 Samuel, and Sarah, it's your turn. To Sarah, listen to me. 2 Samuel. Oh boy, wasn't that good? Chapter 7. Read until you're tired, and then I'll pick it up. Because we're going to read the whole chapter.
Okay. After the king had been living in his palace a while, and Anani had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I'm living in Cedarwood Palace, but the ark of God is kept in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go do everything that is in your heart, for Anani is with you." But the same night the word of Anani came to Nathan. Go and tell the servant David that this is what Anani says. You are going to build me a house to live in. Since the day I brought the people of Israel out of Egypt until today, I have never lived in a house. Rather, I have traveled in a tent and a tabernacle. Everywhere I traveled with all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word to any of the tribes of Israel, whom I've ordered to shepherd my people Israel, asking, "Why haven't you built me a cedar wood house?" Therefore say this to my servant David, that this is what Adonai
Zavat
says, "I took you from the sheep yards, from following the sheep, to make you chief over my people, over Israel. I have been with you whenever you went. I have destroyed all your enemies ahead of you, and I'm making your reputation great, like the reputation of the greatest people on earth. I will assign a place to my people of Israel. I will plant them there so that they can live in their own place without being disturbed anymore. The wicked will no longer oppress them as they did at the beginning and as they did from the time I ordered judges to be over my people Israel. Instead, I will give you rest from your enemies." Moreover, Anani tells you that Anani will make you a house. When your days come to an end and you sleep with your ancestors, I will establish one of your descendants to succeed you, one of your own flesh and blood, and I will set up his rulership. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be the father for him, and he will be a son for me. If he does something wrong, I will punish him with a rod and blows, just as everyone gets punished. Nevertheless, my grace will not leave him, as I took it away from Shaul, who I removed from before you. Thus your house and your kingdom will be made secure forever before you. Your throne will be set up forever. Nathan told David all these words and described this entire vision.
And David went in and sat before Adonai and said, "Who am I, Adonai Elohim? And what is my family that has caused you to bring me this far? Yet, in your view, Adonai Elohim, even this was too small a thing. So you have even said that your servant's dynasty will continue on into the distant future. This is indeed a teaching for a man, Adonai Elohim. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant intimately, Adonai Elohim. It is for the sake of your word and in accordance with your own heart that you have done all this greatness and revealed it to your servant. Therefore, you are great, Adonai God." There's the word Yahweh. "For there is no one like you, and there is no God besides you." Everything we have heard confirms that. Who can be compared with your people, with Israel? What other nation on earth did God set out to redeem and make into a people for himself? You made yourself a reputation by doing for your land things that even for you are great and terrifying, for the sake of your people whom you redeemed for yourself from Egypt and from other nations and from their gods. You set up your people for yourself as your people forever. And you, Adonai, became their God. So now, Adonai God, establish forever the word you have spoken to your servant in his house. Do what you have promised. May your name be magnified forever, so that it will be said, Adonai Tzavat is God over Israel, and the dynasty of your servant David will be set up in your presence. You, Adonai Tzvat, God of Israel, have disclosed to your servant, I will build you a house. This is why your servant has the courage to pray this prayer to you. Now, Adonai Elohim, you alone are good, God. Your words are truth, and you have made this wonderful promise to your servant. So may it please you to bless the family of your servant, and thereby cause it to continue forever in your presence. For you, Adonai Elohim, have said it. May your servant's family be blessed forever by your blessing. And then the story goes on. The story goes on with David having successes and conquests and expanding the reach of the kingdom and the wealth of the kingdom, and setting aside the preparations for the building of the house of God. But God continues to build his house. And this proclamation of God, I will build you a house. You will not build me a house. I will build you a house. And I will put your descendant on a throne. And he will be punished, but the grace of my spirit shall not be taken from him. The forever king, of course, is Messiah, Yeshua. Messiah must be of the house of David for Adonai to keep his promise, and that is that Jesus is of the house of David in the lineage. But eventually, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and most monarchs believe, whether or not they really have it, that they have absolute power. Eventually they believe it. David falls into sin. He takes another man's wife. There's some sense in which David has become accustomed to the exercise of power. He has not spent years and years and years resolutely disobeying God or ignoring God by any means. And that'll be the foundation of his salvation, because he's a man after God's own heart. And while power corrupts, he is not corrupted absolutely like Saul. There's a difference. David's great sin is not to persistently do things against the will of God. At the bottom of that slide says, what's the difference? Saul didn't commit adultery. That's not a big feature of his story, is it? It's rather prominent in David's story. In both cases, there's nothing considered wrong with having multiple wives. David has more than one wife when he sees Bathsheba. He has plenty of sons, which will cause him trouble. Multiple sons by multiple wives. That didn't go too well for Abraham, did it? Doesn't go well for David either. Much of the sadness of his aging years comes from a rebellious family, accustomed to power, grasping for power improperly, prematurely. But that's not David's sin. It's his sorrow. It's not his sin. Saul turns his back on God. That's the difference. David doesn't. Now, Saul tries to deflect blame by blaming the people and so forth. David just tries to hide what he's done. And in so doing, makes it much worse. He doesn't just commit murder. Bathsheba's husband dies at David's order. But David arranges for her husband to be left exposed on the battlefield. So what does he do in that process? He corrupts the commander to whom he gives the command. Put this man out front so that in the heat of the battle you may withdraw and he will die. So what he's done is he has implicated and corrupted somebody else in murder. It's a conspiracy. It's not just him. But Samuel came to Saul, and Saul made excuses. What did David do when Nathan came to him? Do you know? And accused him of what he'd done. What did David do?
He took responsibility and prayed for God's forgiveness.
He didn't just, and you're right. You're absolutely right about everything you said. But he went further. Right?
He also, Saul tried to, it stuck out to me that he asked for Samuel basically not to embarrass him in front of his people. But it stuck out to me that David even wailed about his sin in front of his servants.
David publicly took the heat. He stood up and said, I am guilty. God have mercy on me. I have sinned. And he had a time of public mourning, call it mortification or humiliation. There was no secret, no hiding, no prevaricating, no blaming others. There is, oh Lord, have mercy on me. I am a sinner and I am guilty. What is the story of Scripture for any soul who does that? What's the response?
And redemption, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. David's no exception in that. He says, have mercy on me, O God. I am a sinner. I have done this evil in your sight and against these people, and I have sinned against you, and against you, O Lord, alone have I sinned. And he makes this public repentance, and God has mercy on him. There will be consequences. And in fact, God tells him, you're going to have a lot of sorrow in this last half of your life. You're going to go through a lot of mess because of all these family problems that are going to come. But you will proclaim the child of this union to be the king. I will make Solomon your successor. Solomon's not his first son, not his second son. She's not his first or second wife, Bathsheba. This is a mess. David's sin will create consequences that will be the source of his great sorrows for the rest of his days as sons rebel and the family, the extended family, some of them turn directly against him, some turn against one another. And he is saddened again and again and again in what we could call his declining years. And he sets it up with what he has done here. David locates the capital of Israel in Jerusalem. Old Salem, it's centrally located, it's easily defended, it's on the border between the northern and the southern tribes. It is, therefore, the center of the people, it's the religious center of the nation. The ark is there, eventually the temple will be there. The centralized worship of God on behalf of the people will be there. He conquers every surrounding foe. He expands the borders. He expands the treasury. The nation never really has a greater period of power in the back and forth among the nations as they do in his time. They will be seen as a people of great prosperity under Solomon. But David has created much of this prosperity. Solomon will spend it. And as he spends it on great works, what we would call public works, what we would call is shovel-ready construction projects, he will become famous as being rich. But in fact, what Solomon is doing is he spends exorbitant sums of money on all of his buildings. Not just the temple, which is lavishly outfitted, but also, for example, the stables of Solomon, the fabled stables, so many fortresses and other things that he built. He will be spending his people into pauperhood while his father left them very prosperous. But what Solomon will manage is also impressive. He inherited a unified people. He inherited a nation at peace. He inherited a well-endowed treasury. He inherited a people with military and political prestige. He built the temple. He built a great palace. He built ancillary palaces and other locations. He built the great chariot city that included the stables of Solomon. In the process, unlike his father, who was a great military man, Solomon relied more upon diplomacy, and he made alliances with many people, many kings, many princes, and it's one of the few times in the history of the people where Israel was seen to be strong enough that their neighbors sought peaceful relations. They were wealthy. Of course, he was spending it, but they were wealthy. And if you read 1 Kings 3 and 1 Kings 8, you'll see that he was devoted to God. But you remember that thing, it's good to start well and it's good to finish well? There's some aspects in which Solomon did not finish well. His public works were so expensive and so large that he wound up having to force people to work on his projects as the years went by, because he couldn't afford to pay just the craftsmen. And so he began to impress, which is to force people into labor for what could be called miserly wages. The tax burden on the people grew and grew and grew. You'll find that late in his life, the resentment against Solomon and his choices of multiple wives from many cultures and bringing their religious practices into the land and bringing their influence in upon his people. And the price of diplomacy being making compromises religiously and culturally, and overlaid over this is the heavy burden of the bill of his grand works that just went on and on and on. And so when you read in the Kings, uh, you you get this picture, and it's not all that great. And so when you get to 1 Kings, and I'm trying to run to it right quick, 1 Kings 11, 4 through 8, you get this. I'll start with 3. He had 700 wives. I'd say he had a problem. All princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. And that means from God. When Shlomo became old, his wives turned his heart away toward other gods, so that he was not wholehearted with Adonai his God, as was David his father. Shaul, totally turned away from God. David was love and obedience, repented of his sins, and bore the consequences of his sins. With many tears, but he bore them. Solomon, Shlomo, became compromised. For Shlomo followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidoni, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammoni. Thus Shlomo did what was evil in Adonai's view, and did not fully follow Adonai as David his father had done. Shlomo built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill in front of Jerusalem, and another for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. This is what he did for all his foreign wives, who then offered and sacrificed to their gods. And the first part of verse 9, so Adonai grew angry with Shlomo. If you take these 3 stories and lay them over the 7 love letters to the 7 churches in the first 3 chapters of Revelation, you can find 3 churches that correspond with those 3 kings. We're not going to do it right now, but it's easy to do. The sin of mankind is not cyclical, but the tendency of people to not learn. This is what Debbie was talking about earlier when all of you were talking. The tendency of people to not learn, to wholeheartedly follow God at all times, inevitably ends poorly for them. And this happens over and over and over, because the Lord wants us. What is the first commandment? What is the first commandment? You shall have no other gods before me. Right? Oh, yeah. And that's Shlomo's great sin. He accepted a lot of them, and he even allowed very public worship of these gods. So when you take the other things he does, he leaves his successor an empty treasury and some really bad feelings and a compromised people religiously. He has brewed up a mess for who comes behind him. So we come here at 7:30, and we're through with this session, and we're about to move to the next one. How about that? And you've already read about the divided kingdom. And now I'm going to get to, there we go. Just bear with me a minute. I got to go to my next thing here. Where'd it go? There we go. No. There we go. And I'll just be real quick to say, I would really like to get myself another glass of water, but before we go, to get a drink or whatever, let's see. We're back to Debbie and Lindsay. So Debbie, if you'll look up and start off on 1 Kings chapter 11, and Lindsay, when she's done with that, 2 Chronicles, which is at the back of the Old Testament in the Jewish system, chapter 9, verses 29 to 31. Oh, I tell you what. Debbie, why don't you read the first 20 verses? And Amy, why don't you read 21 through 40 of 1 Kings 11? Let's do that, okay? And let's take 3 or 4 minutes. And if you want to replenish your water cup, I sure need to. And we'll meet back and pick up what will be on your slides, session 6. All righty. All righty. If we're ready, let's roll.
Okay. King Shlomo loved many foreign women besides the daughter of Pharaoh. There were women from the Moabi, Ammoni, Edomite, Tisdoni, and Hittite, nations about which Adonai had said to the people of Israel, "You are not to go among them, or they among you, because they will turn your hearts away toward their gods." But Shlomo was deeply attached to them by his love. He had 700 wives, all princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Shlomo became old, his wives turned his heart away toward other gods, so that he was not wholehearted with Adonai his God, as David his father had been. For Shlomo followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of Zidoni, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammoni. Thus Shlomo did what was evil in Adonai's view, and did not fully follow Adonai, as David his father had done. Shlomo built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moab, on the hill in front of Jerusalem, and another for Moloch, the abomination of the people of Ammon. This is what he did for all his foreign wives, who then offered in sacrifice to their gods. So Adonai grew angry with Shlomo, because his heart had turned away from Adonai, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and given him orders concerning this matter, that he should not follow other gods. But he didn't obey Adonai's orders. So Adonai said to Shlomo, "Since this is what has been in your mind, and you haven't kept my covenant and my regulations which I ordered you to obey, I will tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. However, for David your father's sake, I won't do it while you are alive, but I will tear it away from your son. Even then, I won't tear away all the kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Then Adonai raised up his adversary against Shlomo, Hadad the Edomite of the royal line of Edom. Back when David had been in Edom, and Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the dead, having killed every male in Edom. For Joab and all Israel had stayed there 6 months, until he had eliminated every male in Edom. Hadad had fled, he and a number of Edomite servants of his father's with him, and gone into Egypt. At the time Hadad had been but a small boy. On their way they passed through the Midian and arrived in Paran. Took with them men from Paran, and went on into Egypt, to Pharaoh king of Egypt. He gave Hadad a house, saw to it that he had food, and gave him land. Hadad became a great favorite of Pharaoh, so that he gave him his own wife's sister in marriage, that is, the sister of Tachneus the queen. The sister of Tachneus bore him Genubat, his son, and along with Pharaoh's sons, and Tachneus brought him up in Pharaoh's own house, so that Genubat was in Pharaoh's house along with Pharaoh's sons.
When Hadad in Egypt heard that David slept with his ancestors and Joab, the commander of the army, was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me leave so I can return to my own country." Pharaoh asked him, "But what have you lacked with me that makes you want just now to go to your own country?" "Nothing in particular," he replied, "but let me leave anyway." God raised up another adversary against Shlomo, Rezon, the son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord Hadad-ezer, the king of Zobah, when David killed the men from Zobah. Rezon rallied men to himself and became the leader of a band of marauders. They went to Damasek and settled there, while he became king of Damasek. He remained an adversary as long as Shlomo lived, causing difficulties in addition to those of Hadad. He detested Israel and ruled Aram. Also, Yarovam, the son of Nevat, an Ephrathi from Sereda, whose mother's name was Zeruah, one of Shlomo's servants, rebelled against the king. Here is the reason he rebelled against the king. Shlomo was building the millow and closing the breach in the wall of the city of David his father. Now this Yaravam was a strong, energetic man, and Shlomo, seeing how serious the young man was, made him supervisor over all the work being done by the tribe of Joseph. Once during this period, when Yaravam had gone out of Jerusalem, the prophet Achiah from Shiloh spotted him traveling. Achiah was wearing a new cloak, and the two of them were alone in the open country. Achiah took hold of his new cloak that he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. Then he said to Yaravam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for here is what Adonai, the God of Israel, says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Shlomo's hand, and I will give 10 tribes to you. But he will keep one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. I will do this because they have abandoned me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidoni, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon. They haven't lived according to my ways, so that they could do what was right in my view and obey my regulations and rulings, as did David his father. Nevertheless, I will not take the entire kingdom away from him, but I will make him a prince as long as he lives, and for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose, because he obeyed my mitzvot and regulations. However, I will take the kingdom away from his son and give 10 tribes of it to you. To his son I will give 1 tribe, so that David my servant will always have a light burning for me in Jerusalem, the city I chose for myself as the place to put my name. I will take you, and you will rule over everything you want. You will be king over Israel. Now, if you will listen to all that I order you, live according to my ways, and do what is right in my view, so that you observe my regulations and mitzvot, as did David my servant, then I will be with you, and I will build you a lasting dynasty, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. For this offense I will trouble David's descendants, but not forever." Because of this, Shlomo tried to kill Yaravam, but Yaravam roused himself, fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and stayed in Egypt until the death of Shlomo.
So this is Jeroboam, who has been told that he will be king over 10 tribes. Solomon attempts to kill him because he knows that Jeroboam wants the throne. While it may be funny for Mel Brooks to say, it's good to be the king, the truth is being the king means that there's always somebody who wants your job, and sometimes at any price. So Yaravam is what we call Jeroboam, and Rechavam is Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Okay, 2 Chronicles 9.
Still in here. All right. Not 2 Chronicles 9:29 through 31.
Uh-huh.
Other activities of Shlomo from beginning to end are written in the records of Nathan the prophet, in the prophecy of Achiah of Shiloh, and in the visions of Yedo the seer concerning Yaravam, the son of Nevat. Shlomo reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then Shlomo slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rechavam, his son, became king in his place.
Yeah. What we call Rehoboam in English. So the question here, is it possible to be a success and to bequeath a failure? Is it possible to be a success and leave behind a failure? That's really what we're looking at. because when John on Patmos writes down the love letters of Jesus to the 7 churches, one of them is lukewarm. And that it perfectly describes Solomon, the last half of his life. He is lukewarm to God. He burns neither hot nor cold. Saul was cold. David was hot. Solomon is lukewarm. And we read upon his death in 1 Kings, Malachim Aleph, chapter 12, Rechavam went to Shechem, where all Israel had come to proclaim him king. Then Yaravam, son of Nevat, heard it. He was still in